Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to look at some data that completely dismantles everything we thought we knew about the American frontier. You know, when we think of the Wild West, our minds almost immediately go to those cinematic standoffs, sweeping, pristine landscapes, and the rugged, heroic cowboy. But the historical data? Well, it tells a completely different, much grittier story. We're going to dig into the hard numbers, the visceral living conditions, and the actual clinical data to reconstruct the brutal, totally unromanticized reality of 19th century westward expansion.
Okay, let's dive into this. We all know the Hollywood version, right? That highly romanticized Little House on the Prairie myth, a pristine place of endless adventure and romance. But the historical frontier was actually defined by disease, starvation, mud, and plummeting life expectancy. The reality is that Manifest Destiny was incredibly dirty. It was a logistical nightmare where every single day was a battle against an unforgiving environment. We are going to shatter that cinematic illusion today and look at the actual, technical mechanics of survival.
Section 1. Trail Logistics, the Math of Survival.
To really understand the frontier, you first have to understand the journey just to get there. We are talking about a massive overland migration that was, at its very core, a brutal math problem. A standard trip out west was roughly 1,900 miles and took over 100 days. Every single step of that journey was a battle for calories. Emigrant guides recommended hauling 50 pounds of flour, 50 pounds of hams, and 25 pounds of bacon per person. The sheer math of the trail is just staggering. It required between 2.5 to 3 pounds of food per person every single day. Multiply that by a family of 4 over 100-day journey, and a single wagon had to haul thousands of pounds of freight, literally just to keep everyone alive. You couldn't exactly pack a light carry-on and hope for the best.
And what happened when the fresh food ran out? A lot of people think pioneers just hunted wild game along the way, but the fast pace of travel and the massive volume of migrants meant that game was actually notoriously scarce and totally unreliable. Instead, survival depended on ultra-dense rations like pemmican and sagamite. These were absolute survival staples made of dried, thin-cut jerked meat mixed with cornmeal or mesquite flour. But here's the wild part. It is absolutely astonishing to consider that a half-pound of sagamite and a half-pound of dried meat only yielded about 1,700 calories. Hauling wagons and walking 15 to 20 miles a day, doing intense manual labor on a massive caloric deficit, it meant people were constantly losing muscle mass and endurance.
Then, once the pioneers finally arrived, a whole new nightmare began, what historians often call the architecture of invisibility. History tends to focus on the men, but frontier women faced an immediate, grueling battle with their environment just to maintain basic subsistence. They were the unseen, completely overworked engine of the frontier, dealing with food preparation, farming, and extreme poverty in conditions that are honestly hard to even fathom today.
Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds, Soddy's and dirt floor realities.
When you arrived on the prairie, there was no lumber depot waiting for you. In fact, there weren't even trees in a lot of places. You had to build your house out of thick, triangle-cut prairie sod. The reality of these soddies was grim, to say the least. Imagine the visceral reality of this for a second. The dirt walls would literally dry out and crumble directly into the family's meals. And when heavy rains came, the roofs leaked constantly, turning the inside of the home into a dark, muddy cave. It was a daily, exhausting battle against constant filth just to keep the home vaguely habitable.
Section 3. The Stench of Survival.
So, if the houses were made of mud, imagine the streets, and the bodies inhabiting them. Clean water was incredibly scarce, and basic sanitation infrastructure simply did not exist. Just to give you an idea of the horrific state of frontier sanitation, listen to this anecdote from Dawson City in 1890. A man named Arthur Walden actually won a wager that he could cross the unpaved main street without getting his shoes muddy. How did he pull that off? By hopping entirely on a makeshift bridge of dead horse carcasses that were just rotting in the street, no joke. Refuse, excrement, and animal carcasses routinely filled the thoroughfares of these boomtowns. It was a level of filth that is almost unimaginable to us now.
Now, what's really interesting about this next point is that you couldn't escape the grime, you just had to share it. In his 1872 travelogue, Roughing It, Mark Twain described a stagecoach station where a tin basin, a pail of water, and a yellow bar of soap were shared by stablemen and every single traveler passing through. Attached to the mirror was a communal comb. As Twain vividly wrote, it had been accumulating hair ever since, along with certain impurities. Yeah.
Think about your morning routine for a second. Mass-produced toothpaste wasn't invented until 1873. Toilet paper didn't appear until 1880, and deodorant Not a thing until 1888. Before these dates, pioneers were using campfire ash or salt to literally scrub their teeth, and without toilet paper, they relied on leaves, pages torn right out of the farmer's almanac, or dry corn cobs. Imagine enduring the blazing heat of a western summer, doing intense manual labor, without running water, soap, or deodorant. Manifest destiny was, quite frankly, incredibly smelly.
Section 4. The Antebellum Mortality Crisis. When you combine an exhausting 1,900-mile journey on a caloric deficit with crumbling mud homes, communal disease-ridden combs, and a total absolute lack of sanitation, the result is devastating. 35 to 40 years. That was the shockingly low life expectancy at birth for individuals during the 19th century frontier era. All of that grit and grime translates directly into this devastating clinical reality.
But here is where the data gets incredibly fascinating. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, there is a massive paradox in American economic history. During the 1840s and 1850s, the United States was experiencing significant economic growth and rising real income per capita. Now, usually as a nation gets richer, its people live longer. It makes sense, right? But the exact opposite happened here. Adult mortality was actually getting significantly worse right before the Civil War.
And this brilliantly illustrates that cohort life expectancy actually took a sharp, data-driven plunge in the 1840s and 1850s. The period mortality rate for adults ages 20 to 49 jumped significantly. For women in particular, period life expectation plummeted from 44.6 years in the 1830s down to just 37.1 years in the 1840s. The peak of westward expansion was, in many ways, a death trap. So, the crucial point is, why did more money mean more death? Well, it was a perfect storm. Shifting disease environments exposed populations moving west to endemic illnesses like malaria and dysentery that don't confer lifelong immunity. Add to that the extreme biological stress of migration itself, increased urbanization and crowding in those incredibly filthy boomtowns we talked about, and poor nutrition from living off hardtack and salt pork.
Furthermore, the direct role of medical intervention was extremely limited at this point. Modern germ theory hadn't even been accepted yet. There were absolutely no antibiotics. The heavy burden of survival fell squarely on women in the household, who were essentially forced to act as nurses and doctors. They relied on rudimentary home remedies to fight off deadly outbreaks of smallpox, diphtheria, and dysentery, very often without clean water to even wash their own hands.
Which brings us to our final, ultimate question. We love to romanticize the frontier as this time of unbridled freedom and adventure, but the data unequivocally shows that we built a nation on a foundation of mud, sweat, scurvy, and a 35-year life expectancy. It was a triumph of endurance over horrific technical and logistical odds. Looking at the raw data, the daily caloric deficits, the crumbling sod houses, and the absolute lack of hygiene, could you have survived the real Wild West? Think about that the next time you turn on a classic Western movie. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history you think you know.